Bound from the port of Kaliningrad is the world's largest and best-equipped ocean research vessel, the academic Keldysh. On board is a team of scientists, filmmakers, and explorers in search of the most tragic and legendary shipwreck of the century. For centuries, man has sought to conquer the sea. Ship design varied by culture, but curiosity to explore beyond the horizon was universal. In time, ships capable of carrying man to distant lands brought together diverse cultures, created opportunities for trade, and confirmed the world was round. In the 1840s, sail began to give way to steam. The development of the steamship was rapid, but it was not until 1900 that the first modern steamship was christened. The golden age of the passenger liner had begun. By 1912, society had experienced a rate of invention unsurpassed in history. Man's mastery of technology fostered the belief there were no problems that couldn't be solved, no questions that couldn't be answered. The arrogance of the times was epitomized by the construction of the largest movable object ever built. Thought virtually unsinkable, the Titanic was the symbol of man's conquest of the forces of nature. Russian oceanographer Anatoly Sergalovich is in charge of the expedition to the Titanic. Accompanying him are some of the world's best deep ocean explorers, filmmakers, and international scientists. An important member of the team is Ralph White, a veteran Titanic explorer. He and Emery Christoph were participants in the 1985 expedition that discovered the famous shipwreck.
165 miles, 15 hours. Should get there about 3:30 in the morning on station.
Rolf, are you sure that the wreck exactly here?
Yes.
How do you know that?
In 1985, besides being an imaging officer standing a watch, I was also the documentary filmmaker. Plus, because of my very heavy and extensive navigational background, I was also working on the prime navigation plot, as we call it. So naturally, once we found the wreck, I was looking right at where it was on the nav plot.
Ralph and I were on the expedition to discover the Titanic in '85. And the thing that I most wanted to do was to get two submarines and large lights and really make really good photographs of the Titanic and do an IMAX film. And actually I had gone the year before we found the Titanic to IMAX to get the conversation started.
Before construction of the Titanic could begin, new slipways with towering gantries had to be erected in the shipyards of Holland and Wolff in Belfast, Ireland. By 1910, 17,000 highly skilled engineers, craftsmen, carpenters, artists, and steelworkers were employed. The Titanic was technologically the most ambitious project then underway anywhere in the world. It was, in effect, the space shuttle of the early 20th century. A local newspaper commented that everything about this ship was on a nightmarish scale. "29 boilers, fired by 159 coal furnaces, generated steam to power the ship's engines. The wing propellers were driven by two 4-story-high reciprocating steam engines. The exhaust steam was then passed to a single giant turbine, which drove the central propeller. Together, the engines could generate a then astounding 50,000 horsepower.
The Titanic disaster happened at the height of what was called the Progressive Period. Everybody believed that things were getting better and better, and particularly in terms of technology, that technology was going to usher in this kind of brave new world of progress.
I think from the Victorian days, from 1901 till 1912, the Edwardians were so sure in the empire, in their material wealth, in their creativity, financial and engineering skills that were around at that period. Everything seemed to be improving, and I think the loss of the Titanic made everyone realize that perhaps these enormous machines weren't quite as safe and reliable as everyone assumed they were.
The story of the Titanic really began several years before her keel was even laid. The Titanic was the product of a process of evolution that was occurring in shipbuilding for the North Atlantic run. Ships were getting bigger, faster, more luxurious all the time.
The Titanic was to be 883 feet long, 93 feet wide, and 11 stories high. Suspended from scaffolds and gantries were newly invented hydraulic riveting machines used to drive some 3 million button-headed rivets into plates, girders, beams, and brackets. The intention was to build a ship as strong as it was large, with a double floor and 15 bulkheads, each independently watertight. It genuinely was felt at the time that a ship could be built so strong as to be virtually unsinkable. As the ship's hull neared completion, workers began to report mysterious hammering sounds beneath the sealed plates of the double floor. Many believed that because of the rapid pace of construction, a man had accidentally been entombed inside the ship. It had happened before on other jobs, and to the ship workers, it was the worst possible omen.
Well, I was only 7 at the time of this proposed journey to Canada, but the moment my mother learned of it, she had this fearsome premonition of danger. I don't think it was a specific thing about the Titanic in the beginning. She just had this terrible premonition that something terrible was going to happen. And it was when she realized that it was the Titanic, the ship we were going in, then it dawned on her that she considered that to claim this ship was unsinkable, which the world was doing at that time, was, in her opinion, flying in the face of the Almighty.
This was still a highly religious culture in 1912, and reminders about human weakness and the power of God and the power of nature were consistent. They were there. Those reminders were made before the Titanic happened, and the Titanic became a particularly powerful reminder of those things.
In the North Atlantic, 400 miles southeast of Newfoundland, the Keldysh nears the Titanic site. On the expedition is Steve Blasko, a marine geologist from the Bedford Institute in Nova Scotia.
So we can penetrate deeper in the bottom, to get longer core, to look back 2 million years. Not just...
I have a strong interest in the ocean. It covers 70% of our planet. It controls our climates. It's a huge resource for us. And yet we know less about the ocean than we know about the backside of the moon.
The Titanic's interaction with the environment will tell us about biologic activity, sediment transport processes, sediment origin and history on the bottom, corrosion rates and whatnot. In effect, Titanic is a kind of time machine by which scientists can look at changes in an environment that we know very little about.
The 422-foot academic Keldysh is the world's largest research vessel and is the mothership of the 2 Mir deep-diving submersibles that will be used on the expedition. The Mirs are capable of reaching crushing depths of 30,000 feet, allowing exploration of an astonishing 98% of the world's oceans. The Mirs hold a crew of 3 in a cramped 6-foot command sphere. 3 1-foot-thick acrylic viewports give each crew member a view on the underwater world. 2 6-foot hydraulic manipulator arms are capable of lifting heavy objects, as well as delicate, fragile, biological and geological specimens for research. The Mirs are also fitted with specially designed photographic and video equipment. Their high-intensity lights have the capability of illuminating the black abyss better than any other submersible.
In 1985, we used state-of-the-art technology to accomplish the mission of finding the Titanic and getting the first photographs. This was the best lighting, the best photography, and the best video that was available at the time. The biggest challenge we faced to do the IMAX film was being able to bring down enough light to the bottom of the ocean to really show vast portions of the Titanic. This was accomplished by developing a special HMI lighting system where we could bring down 25 to 30,000 watts of light per sub using 2 subs, so in effect 70,000 watts of light, and that's how we were able to get these really spectacular images.
Everybody knew that lighting was really what this was all about, and previous trips to the Titanic had only been a single submarine with small quartz lights, and we knew that we wanted to light this thing up. It's really like a Hollywood movie.
Titanic lays facing slightly to the northeast. It's in 2 sections, bow and stern. Got about 600 meters in between. Debris field.
Titanic lies approximately 12,800 feet below sea level in what is now called Titanic Canyon. Ralph White, a veteran of numerous Titanic dives, will guide the Keldysh crew on their expedition using his extensive knowledge of the wreckage and debris field. 4 transponders are dropped to the sea floor where they will form an electronic grid 2 miles square surrounding the wreck site. With these, they hope to build a detailed map of the debris field and the 2 main sections of the Titanic. The Keldysh holds the distinction of being the only ship in the world equipped with 2 deep ocean submersibles. The team plans 17 dives to the Titanic in what will be one of the most ambitious scientific expeditions ever attempted.
Привет! Welcome aboard!
I believe that was the first time that a serious attempt was made to look at the interaction between Titanic and its environment.
Pumping seawater into their ballast tanks, the submersibles begin the 2.5-hour descent to the seafloor, 12,800 feet beneath the Keldysh, where they will explore the Titanic's debris field. Within 1,000 feet of the surface, all traces of sunlight will disappear. The near-freezing salt water, perpetual blackness, and unimaginable pressure below remain a challenge even for these submersibles of the late 20th century. Throughout the descent, lighting booms are kept open and away from the pressurized hulls of the subs. The greatest danger is around 8,000 feet, where the implosion of a single light bulb could destroy a submersible. As the water pressure increases to an extraordinary 6,000 pounds per square inch, the slightest leak in a sub would produce a razor-sharp jet of water, powerful enough to slice a human body in half.
Keldysh, we are on the bottom.
Once the Mir submersibles are on the bottom, the Keldysh gives them their exact position relative to the debris field. The Mirs then use side-scan sonar to navigate the sea floor. This navigation system gives them a 140-degree view electronically of what's in front of them in the darkness.
We are proceeding on a northeast course, approximately 60 degrees.
Might be getting some coals, some small coals in.
The Titanic dumped 5,000 tons of coal when it broke apart at the surface. It's almost always the first sign that a wreck is nearby. Lumps of coal everywhere.
Okay, we're starting to get it on the starboard side. We have a little coal over here.
In January of 1912, the coal miners in Great Britain went on strike. Industry and shipping in 1912 were almost universally fueled by coal. By mid-March of 1912, there was no coal to be found commercially anywhere in Great Britain. So the White Star Line decided that they would cancel the sailings of a couple of their ships, the Oceanic and the Adriatic, transfer what coal they had to the Titanic. That way the Titanic would have enough fuel for her maiden voyage, and there would be no need to postpone the maiden voyage any further. This wound up with a number of passengers being transferred from not only the Oceanic and the Adriatic, but also the American liner Philadelphia.
First pictures.
This stuff must have rained down for hours after the ship hit the bottom, like a small city exploding over your head. Over there on the left are the remains of a bronze end piece for a deck bench.
In 1987, an international group of investors sponsored a mission to recover artifacts from the Titanic debris field. Once on the surface, the artifacts received immediate conservation efforts to prevent further erosion. Some of the items included pieces of the ship's china, sterling silver flatware, the captain's megaphone, the ship's bell the lookouts rang from the crow's nest when they spotted the iceberg, a hand-carved cherub that adorned the first-class aft staircase, a safe, which turned out to only contain 7 silver coins, and a black leather bag bearing the White Star Line logo. The bag contained $65,000 in banknotes, over 300 gold coins, an exorbitant amount of diamond jewelry, and numerous gold watches.
There are 2 schools of thought on taking artifacts from the debris field or the area of the Titanic. It is really not a science battle. It is not an archaeological battle. It is more of an emotional battle. Some people feel that it is a grave site and shouldn't be touched. Of the 7 expeditions that have been there, no one has ever found what we call a trace element, a trace of a human body being on the bottom of the ocean.
The people who are opposed to salvage take the view that this is a grave site and that it's sacrilege to tamper with it, and feel that it's, you know, the most crass kind of exploitation to bring this stuff to the surface and to put it on display. I think it's interesting that both sides of this battle claim their reverence for the ship and its memory.
Oh, bro, you see some distorted sediments. You see.
Okay,
It's rising,
all right,
rising.
there's some of the metal. Oh, come left, Anatoly, come left. We got an engine. I think we got an engine telegraph.
Okay, bring it up just a tiny bit.
Trimming half.
Just a bit, good.
I turn a little bit left. Is it okay?
I like it really much. Okay.
One of the mysteries from the Titanic were the settings on the engine telegraphs. The command from the bridge was all stop. The return from the engine room indicated slow ahead.
Captain Smith was a very typical Edwardian male skipper. He had reached the very zenith of his career in 1912. The practices, the skills that he had been developed from the days of sail.
Captain Edward J. Smith was the most experienced mariner in service in the White Star Line, and probably the most respected captain on the North Atlantic run. He never had a serious accident. He was at the pinnacle of his career. In fact, he had planned on retiring after he brought the Titanic back from New York. He was going to literally go out in a blaze of glory.
Mir 2, we are in the debris field. We have debris. The third-class toilets on the Titanic were made of iron. Like this one, the second class were made of porcelain. First class was, of course, marble. The Titanic's manifest listed over 18,000 bottles of wine, liquor, and champagne. You'll notice the bottles still have corks in them, even though they've been pushed in by the sea pressure. When the Titanic broke apart, a lot of the galley equipment landed in this area of the debris field. We call it Hell's Kitchen.
We're right near in the area where we found the black bag in '87.
Come on, get the black bags around.
I see black bags there, you know.
No, that one over there is luggage.
We can't take them, Ralph. What are you going to do with them?
I just want to confirm they're there. I mean, that's the best scenario we have, is that stuff all came out of the safe and went in the black bag. Sure, we should take it.
Is it proper bags?
Yeah. Move down and settle on the bottom near that one.
Yeah, fine.
I'm
Okay.
going to activate the arm.
I stopped the vehicle.
I'll show you what condition this is in after 79 years. Look at how well it holds together. Watch this.
Anything that's organic that reaches the bottom is very quickly consumed by animals on the bottom, because they're basically always scavenging for food. The only thing that would survive would be anything that was preserved. If you preserve leather or you preserve wood, of course that makes those things basically toxic to attacking organisms, so they can't consume them or they die drying. So you're only preserved, the material on the bottom is left.
Look at it. That bag is just in almost as perfect shape as the day it was put on the ship.
I think our contract doesn't allow us to do this, Ralph.
Okay, what about if the ship's log or the Rubaiyat's in there?
It'd be wonderful, but...
Okay.
Ralph, we have scientific mission.
This will only take 10 minutes. Let's just see what...
We shouldn't take anything, you know.
Let's don't take anything, but let's see if the ship's log or the Rubaiyat may be in the bag.
I don't like any scandal, you know. I'm sorry about it.
No scandals.
I'm responsible for that.
If it stays on the bottom, it's not a scandal. But if it is the ship's log, a lot of questions could be answered.
Yeah, but if we try to take it right now, it'll just ruin the bag, and we might
you
rip
wish.
the Rubaiyat. Mark it. We'll come back later, Ralph. I mean, save it for later.
You just can touch, but not take. That's it.
Okay, let's just take a look out there and see if that's one of the back bags to begin with.
Just touch if you wish.
Gonna kind of feel it a little bit.
All right, now let me see if I can get the top to pry open and see what's inside this bag.
No, Rolf, I don't think so. You should open this bag because it's not yours, you know. It belongs to some other people.
It's right here. It's in the arm.
Put it down gently. Put it down gently.
Put it down.
Give me it.
Put it on the bottom.
Okay. Now I think. Okay. Now it's.
I'd never seen a big ship before. And really, as you looked along the side of it, you simply couldn't see the end of it. It was so long. And I was quite fascinated by that. And then we went aboard. And there was I, gazing with wonder at this marvelous ship. And my father so excited. And we went up in the lift onto the boat deck, and my mother said to my father, "Well, now I know why I'm so frightened. Because that is the ship they are claiming is unsinkable." And my father put his arm around her and said, "No, my dear, that's the ship that is unsinkable."
The Titanic was enough of a story, even before the disaster happened, to kind of create this myth that it was an unsinkable ship.
In a lot of ways, it was like a Greek tragedy, just a series of events, a chain of events, one leading to the other. You had the arrogance of Edwardian society, believing that they could build an unsinkable ship, and consequently not taking adequate precautions in the face of known hazards and known danger. You had a whole array of details that went wrong for that ship. From the time she left Southampton Harbor, even before that, even when she was building, decisions made about her design, about her equipment, about the course that she would take, about how she was being navigated, the weather conditions, the ice conditions, which were freak conditions for 1912. The ice was much farther south than it had ever been before. All of these details contributed to that convergence of the twain, as Thomas Hardy called it, of ice and steel.
To me, what's most interesting isn't that it's a story that transcends time, but that it's a story that's been told and retold in time, that we keep making it meaningful to us. It was made meaningful to people in 1912, and we've again made it meaningful to us in different terms now. And that suggests that the disaster isn't timeless, isn't the stuff of Greek tragedy, but is timely, is the stuff of history.
219er3 and ascending ETA about an hour and a half to surface. Out.
The dive to the debris field is a success. At the completion of each dive, the submersibles require a 24-hour turnaround. During this time, its batteries are recharged, the camera is reloaded, and the crew rests. The Titanic offers a unique time marker for the scientific study of shipwrecks.
What's of interest to us from a scientific standpoint, 4 things. When Titanic was built, it was well documented. There were lots of pictures of it, so we can go back to those archival pictures and use them as a basis for analysis. Secondly, when Robert Ballard discovered the wreck in 1985, he had in fact reconstructed it as it present stands, so it's a tremendous framework for us to do our geological, biological, conduct chemical experiments. Titanic was brand new when it hit the bottom, so anything that's happened to it has been a function of its residence time on the bottom. Thirdly, it had been in the deep ocean for 79 years, and that's long enough for even a subtle process, be it geological, biological, chemical, to be apparent to scientists. And finally, it was located in the continental rise area in water depths of 12,800 feet. This is a transition zone between the continental slope and the deep abyssal plains of the Atlantic, and it's an area we as scientists know very little about.
There have been probably less than 100 people who've had the privilege of diving to the Titanic. By sending down photographers like myself, we are able to capture images and bring them back so that not only the scientists, but the general public can see what very few people are ever going to be able to see, the wreck of this magnificent ship.
The Mears have once again descended to the sea floor. On this dive, they will explore the Titanic's stern section.
Look at what we have here. Oh.
Oh, wonderful. A piece of brass. A piece of brass.
That isn't brass, Emery. I'm going to sneak in a little bit. Is that gold or is that gold?
Come on now, Ralph. It's a piece of brass.
No, that's gold. Brass would be a little bit more tainted, a little more tainted.
No, Rolf, I don't think you should do it, please no.
Okay, I'll put it on the bottom.
Okay, only sediments, nothing else,
Anatoly.
Yeah.
A little rust out here. Look, I think we got a river.
Where?
Okay, it's out here, starboard side. Make a right.
The phenomenon known as rust rivers occurs when the rusticles growing off the Titanic's metal surfaces come into contact with the ship's deck and then dissolve onto the sea floor.
Robert Ballard in 1985 and 86 in the original investigation had noted the presence of what looked like icicles dangling from the ship, but they were red, and he coined the term rusticle. We collected samples of them and have since determined by analyzing the sample chemically and biologically that the rusticles are composed of products made by bacteria that are actually metabolizing or consuming the sulfur and the iron in the steel of Titanic.
The wreckage has become a vast deep-water ecosystem, offering new habitat to dozens of animal species. An oasis in an otherwise sterile, muddy desert. Miles from the nearest sunlight and photosynthesis, specialized coral survives by filtering nutrients from the water currents. Rat-tailed fish, though virtually blind, seek out the remains of dead animals descending from above.
Remember, up till the late 1960s, we thought the deep ocean was a lifeless void. And what we found is that over the last 25 years, it's not. And Titanic added more information to that whole story. Biologist Lev Moskalev, when he started out, said, well, this is 12,800 feet, it's pretty dark down there, it's 34 degrees Fahrenheit, it's cold, pressure 6,000 pounds per square inch, there's no light, there wasn't any light, so he expected to see 10 or 12 species of animals. And quite amazed when he came back that he had 28 different species of animals. So he came back with this realization that maybe the deep ocean is far more active than we understand.
It is here, on the decks of the stern section, where most of the 1,500 victims stood clinging to the railings as the ship slid into the icy black water. The tail section is separated from the bow by some 2,000 feet. The positioning confirms that the ship broke apart at the surface. The bow section, having filled with water, was impervious to the immense pressure and was able to retain its hydrodynamic shape. It actually went forward about 1,800 feet before embedding its forward section 50 feet into the ocean floor. The stern section had not flooded at the surface and imploded during its descent, leaving a mass of twisted steel.
Exploring a shipwreck like the Titanic is probably the most dangerous thing any of us have ever done. If we were to get entangled with a cable or have a piece of wreckage fall on us, the only thing we could do is sit there and wait to die. We would probably freeze to death in 3 days.
It's on your side, Emery, on your side.
Okay.
Got it?
Yeah.
That's the
oh,
base.
I'm gonna want
That's
some
the
pictures.
base.
I'm gonna
Okay.
want some pictures on that.
Okay, that's the base.
That is really gonna look good. Okay, let's one on the base, real
Okay.
fast.
This is one of the famous reciprocating steam engines. It's over 4 stories high, and its pistons are 8 feet across. They remain to this day the largest steam engines ever built. Right there you can clearly see where air was trapped and the water pressure blew a hole in the side of the engine cylinder.
If you were a man who survived the Titanic disaster, you had a lot to answer for. You really did. So that J. Bruce Ismay, who was the chairman of the White Star Line, was a universal villain in the American press, not only because he was a man who got into a lifeboat while some women and children didn't, but also because of his position as the owner of the ship, in effect. And the owner of the ship should go down with it. And so he's doubly a coward. But it really was a stigma if you were a man to have survived. And so either you had to explain that you had jumped at the last minute and through an extraordinary feat of athleticism, you'd made your way to a lifeboat and gotten hauled in, or you had to explain that you had been chosen to row a lifeboat. You'd been asked by the crew to get in. But if you just found yourself in a lifeboat, you had a lot to answer for.
The Edwardians had a belief that it was better to die than to be perceived a coward. And what were these men dying for? And a lot of them knew they were going to die. The 34 engineers kept the power going. The Titanic had lights and electricity for the wireless until just about 2 minutes before she actually sank. Those engineers never had a chance. Chief Engineer Bell released them about 2 o'clock, said, go make your way to the top decks. Save yourselves. They stayed down in the ship, making sure the electricity stayed going until the very end. They knew they weren't going to get away. All right, why? What was worth dying for? Why was it so important? They were dying because they wanted other people to live.
Okay.
Just a moment, just a moment. Take it easy.
You got a green board.
No,
green
no,
board.
just a moment.
Green
Well,
board.
we're looking back here. I don't
Okay.
see a penetrator leaking.
Oh, boy.
And
Okay, you got a little overhang. Got a little overhang.
Yeah, you got a lot of cable. You got a lot of cable out the
Back
starboard
it,
side.
back,
The
back,
starboard side of
back.
the cable.
Vehicle
Back it
doesn't
up.
move anymore. I think that we are stacking, you know.
No, go down
Well,
and back. Down and back.
Your television's not telling you very much.
I take some.
I got the feeling you're caught over here, some on the right here, too.
Guys, just a moment. Yeah, okay.
Okay, you're clearing the overhang. You're clearing the overhang here.
Okay.
Mirror 2, Mirror 2, this is Mirror 1. Steve, ask Gina to give us a look over.
Yeah, Ralph, looks like a lot of debris topside just above your head there. There's rust and bits of debris and wreckage on top of the sub. I don't know what you've run into, but it looks to be the main point of contact.
Roger, copy that. We have debris and damage to the shell. We will proceed up and you will follow. Out.
The Mears are forced to cut their dive short. With 6,000 pounds of pressure per square inch, the slightest damage to a submersible's hull could be catastrophic. Throughout the expedition, hundreds of specimens of fish, coral, rock, mud, and water samples are collected from the regions surrounding the Titanic. Steve Blasco recovers core samples from the sea floor.
From the ship, we actually deployed large coring devices that weigh a ton. And these have a long barrel tube on them. They drop through the water column and push into the ocean floor. It's like a giant arrow with weights on the end. As we push into the bottom, sediments could come up the center part of the tube. However, we didn't get 10 or 20 feet of penetration. We only got 3 feet, and it was because the sediments were so dense and so tough.
Well, stop!
This stuff looks more like what we'd see from a large landslide, a major landslide having ripped down the valley. Can't believe it. It's really quite dense. That really explains to me why this Titanic didn't disappear. If this had been all very soft sediments, this whole particular Titanic would have disappeared 30, 40 meters into this sediment here. And because it's so stiff and dense, it accounts for the Titanic sitting on the surface. I mean, that ship weighed a ton when it went down. It's only punched in by 3 or 4 or 5 meters in the bottom. And these stiff sediments really account for that. I'm quite pleased with that.
On the day the Mir crews are to dive to the bow section, the rough seas have generated a strong 2-knot current. In order to compensate, the submersibles have been dropped some 3 miles north of the Titanic. The Keldysh will return to its station above the wreck to help the descending subs with navigation.
Got it coming in. Got it coming in.
I don't really remember a lot of people. There must have been people milling about. They were ghostly figures in my memory. I don't really remember very much about them.
We're traveling the same path along the starboard side that the iceberg took. The top of the berg would have been to our left, showering ice onto the deck of the Titanic. Survivors' accounts tell us that some of the passengers were picking up the ice and playing with it. Some even put it in their drinks. We're coming up on the number 3 cargo hold. Deep down there is where the third-class passengers were. Those poor souls were trapped and never had a chance.
The larger the ship is, the cheaper passengers can be taken across the Atlantic. There was such a demand for third-class passengers, immigrants, to travel from the old world to the new world, to America. Steamship companies were just overwhelmed. They just couldn't keep pace with it. And it's not the first class and the second class passengers that were really the primary reason why these big ships were built. It was the third class, it was the immigrants. And of course, once they were in America and they got employment, they were able then to act as almost as a bridgehead to bring other members of the family across. The steamship companies were well aware of this. So they treated third class passengers extremely well, even though they were only one-way passengers. Remember, there's no return fare here. Important to treat them very, very well. That's why they had up to 4 meals a day. That's why they had stewards serving them at table. That's why they didn't have to bring their own bed linen or china and knives and forks. It was all laid on for them. And each passenger would be given a little menu card. And on the back of that menu card was a postcard. They would be invited to send back that little postcard, one side a postcard, one side a menu, back to their relatives living in Russia or Scandinavia or wherever. And they could prove that they'd had a good time traveling from Europe to America by the White Star Line.
The third-class passengers within the social structure of 1912 very often were exactly that, third class. They were predominantly, not exclusively, but predominantly, members of the working class. And they and their forebears had spent generation after generation being told what to do, when to do it, where to go, by the people who the society had placed over them. It cost many of them their lives. There were locked barriers between the third-class areas of the ship and the rest of the vessel. Those barriers were not put up by the White Star Line to keep the third-class passengers out and away from the lifeboats. Those barriers were required by American immigration laws.
Unfortunately, we don't know very much about the behavior of the crew towards the third-class passengers on board the Titanic because principally there were very few survivors that worked in that class. But what we do know is that a great many of the third-class passengers were kept below decks.
In all of the confusion that existed among the Titanic's officers and crew the night that she went down, no one made certain that those gates and barricades were unlocked and opened, allowed the third-class passengers access to the boats and the upper decks. Some of them were open, some of them weren't, but nobody made sure that all of them were. There was no policy of discrimination against third class. What happened was they were forgotten about.
There's the mast. It contained the crow's nest which the lookouts used to peer out into the night. The story goes, one of them even said he could smell icebergs. Unfortunately for the ship, they didn't see it in time.
It would be safe to say that what Captain Smith did in terms of navigating the ship, what his procedures were for posting lookouts, handling the ice warnings and such, he was doing nothing different than any other skipper on the North Atlantic would have done in similar circumstances. It was an SOP, standard operating procedure, to get an ice warning, to post extra lookouts, but maintain your speed. Within the living memory of most of the people on board that vessel, no one had ever known of a ship striking an iceberg and sinking.
Actually, the American inquiry into the disaster, the Senate hearings on the disaster, painted Smith in a much more negative light. They said that Smith bore a lot of the responsibility for what had happened because he'd disregarded those iceberg warnings and had been foolishly complacent about his own ship and its ability to plow its way through ice fields. So even at the time, Smith wasn't universally viewed as a hero.
We're passing over the well deck, or the promenade area for the third-class passengers. On the night the ship sank, they had a party going on with their own music and dancing. No doubt a few first-class passengers would have been watching from the decks above.
Well, I had an enormous teddy bear. My father bought it for me the Christmas before we went away in the April. And it was almost as tall as myself. I loved this teddy bear, and I used to play with it on the deck with my father. And I wanted to go back for my teddy bear when he was carrying me out of the cabin to take me up to the boat deck, you know. I remember saying, I want my teddy bear, and he just didn't say anything, just continued to carry me. And when we got onto the deck, and he said, yes, they're going to launch the lifeboats, but it's only a precaution, you'll all be back on board for breakfast. When he put me in the lifeboat, and he leaned over and he said, now be a good girl, hold Mummy's hand. I did have an instinctive feeling then. I felt I wouldn't see him again. But it was a beautiful teddy bear. Never had another one. Never wanted another one.
White Star was very proud of these high-tech electric cranes. They were used to load the possessions of the world's richest people.
The Titanic attracted the most impressive group of passengers ever assembled for a North Atlantic crossing. On board her maiden voyage were real estate tycoon John Jacob Astor, millionaire playboy Benjamin Guggenheim, Macy's founder Isidor Straus and his wife, Ida, Pennsylvania Railroad President John B. Thayer, and heir to Philadelphia's largest fortune, George Widener.
The fact that these were extremely well-known millionaires and they were lost, and it shook society in the sense that suddenly there was a discussion of whether their lives were more valuable than some of the people who had actually been saved. And it's surprising to me the number of commentators at the time who said that, in effect, their lives were more valuable, and that a millionaire, a man of wealth and influence and power, who controls the destiny of hundreds, if not thousands of people, has a superior right to live in a disaster like this than some poor anonymous person from the steerage down below who doesn't have that kind of social role, who doesn't have that kind of impact.
The story of the Olympic and the Titanic can be traced back to 1902, when a gentleman called J. Pierpont Morgan, who was an American banker and financier, bought the White Star Line, and effectively the White Star Line then became an American company. And his concept was to create a giant monopoly on the North Atlantic, effectively to price fix.
This is J.P. Morgan's private suite. It was the largest on the ship and even had a private promenade deck.
J.P. Morgan had booked passage on the Titanic's maiden voyage, but canceled at the last minute because of an illness.
Over on the right is where the wheelhouse and the bridge would have been. Directly ahead, by the ventilator shaft, is the collapsed bulkhead of Captain Smith's cabin. These windows looked into Captain Smith's private sitting room.
After the collision, Captain Smith's behavior, his decision-making process, for a time, very decisive. And he reacts, he gives orders, he directs the actions of his officers and crew, and then all of a sudden something happens to him. And his decisions become vague. He gives incomplete orders. He doesn't make sure the orders are followed up. He doesn't bother to walk down the boat deck to see if the boats are being filled to capacity.
I think when Captain Smith realized that the Titanic would founder, I think he was so shocked by that news, like many other passengers and certainly many of the other officers, couldn't really come to terms with the fact that this ship would sink. And I think from that moment on, I think the effective command structure of the Titanic just basically broke to pieces.
Right around midnight, he had a conference with Thomas Andrews, who was the man who had built the Titanic. And Andrews explained very carefully and very clearly that the Titanic was going to sink. It was not a question of if, it was only a question of when. Smith suddenly realized that 1,000 people under his care, who were in his responsibility, in his charge, were going to die.
Captain Smith spent his final hour here on the bridge. This is all that remains of the steering gear. The ship's wooden wheel has been eaten away by treacle worms. From this spot, the sailors tried to turn the Titanic away from the iceberg, but they failed.
The Californian was 11 miles away from the Titanic when the Titanic sank. The Californian's officers stood on her bridge watching the Titanic firing distress rockets. 3 separate times they told Captain Lord there was a ship nearby firing white rockets. Lord did nothing. He didn't order the Californian to steam over to the ship that was firing the rockets. He didn't even order the wireless operator awoken. The Carpathia, Rostron's ship, was almost 60 miles from the Titanic. When Harold Cottam, who was the wireless operator on the Carpathia, got the Titanic's distress signal, he ran out onto the bridge, ran up to the Carpathia's first officer, Dean, and said, "Sir, the Titanic is sinking, she needs our help." Then Cottam turned around, ran down to the captain's cabin, didn't even knock, just threw open the door, ran in and said, "Sir, the Titanic is sinking. She requests our assistance immediately." Now, Rostron swung his legs out of his bunk, looked at First Officer Dean and said, "Mr. Dean, turn the ship around. Now, Cottam, are you sure it's the Titanic, and are you sure she needs our help?" Arthur Rostron wasn't willing to waste the seconds necessary to confirm Cottam's report before he acted. He had the ship turning around even before he got confirmation. He thundered north as fast as he could go, dodging icebergs, dodging growlers, because there was someone out there who needed his help. And nothing was going to get in his way.
The safety of navigation at sea in those days was the responsibility primarily of the Board of Trade, and this is the British government organisation which is set up to police merchant ships at that period. And they would have varying regulations, number of life jackets on board, number of lifeboats. But ships had become so large so quickly that they outpaced the regulations. Most regulations said that you had to have about 16 lifeboats on a vessel up to 10,000 tons. Well, of course, Titanic weighed 45,000 tons, carrying far more passengers than a 10,000-ton vessel. Yet she had lifeboat provision for a 10,000-ton ship.
Lifeboats are of a standard size. They carry 65 people. And the regulation that was in effect in 1912 had been formulated in 1895. The decision to only carry the minimum number of lifeboats required by law was actually made by Bruce Ismay, the chairman of the White Star Line. It was made in the light of not only the belief that the ship was unsinkable and the lifeboats would not be needed, but also to maximize the deck space for the convenience of the passengers. It was a businessman's decision.
Mother and I were safely put aboard the last lifeboat to safely leave the ship, Collapsible D, and the boat was rowed as rapidly as they could, and they stopped rowing, and I quickly looked over there to where the boat was, and there came this explosion, and all the lights disappeared.
In the early morning hours of April the 15th, 1912, the Titanic sank. Carrying only enough lifeboats for less than half her passengers and crew, 1,517 lives were lost. The Keldish's mission was a bittersweet success. Our scientific and filmmaking objectives were accomplished on the 17 dives to the wreck. Yet witnessing the ship itself overpowered them. The images and stories of the tragic event poured forth, bringing to life the enormity of the tragedy in a way none of us expected. We are left with one bright spot, that we are still learning from this tragedy. In its aftermath, maritime laws were changed to ensure the safety of those traveling by ship. And now, decades later, the Titanic's interaction with its environment is teaching us about our deep oceans.
Nearly a century has passed since the Titanic sank, and her story still possesses a compelling power. It is the individual acts of heroism, sacrifice, and honor played out on the decks that moonless night that endure in our consciousness, and in some way, large or small, move us all.